do the shared screen. Okay.
That's true. No, not okay. This thing should go in here. And how to move it?
You have to stop sharing. I think that's
No,
No?
I don't think so,
Okay.
because it shows up this way when it's so this way. No.
It's not
This way.
right?
It
And for that, I think you have
it
to
is
stop.
it is being recorded.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Okay,
it is.
okay, so I can.
Yeah. So just one moment. Yeah. Always switch off my phone. So shall we start?
Yes, please.
Good. Thank you very much for coming to this fourth and last lecture. So today I'm going to speak about morphology-syntax interface in polysynthetic languages, and in general how polysynthetic morphology interacts with syntax. So let me first briefly recapitulate from the last seminar. A week ago, we discussed the polysynthetic features of the Northwest Caucasian languages, which comprise extensive polypersonalism facilitated by a rich and productive system of applicatives, and this whole system fits very well the term open head marking proposed by Johannes-Nichols. There are lexical affixes of different kinds in these languages, but primarily locative affixes. There are also certain vestiges of noun incorporation and verb root serialization, both of them feeding this locative affixation. And also, morphological organization of these languages shows a really complex interplay of templatic and scope-based types. Importantly, a large part of the Northwest Caucasian polysynthetic morphology serves the purposes of syntax in various ways. So pronominal affixes as well as applicatives and open head marking in general is used to express and track arguments and reference in general. And well, given that the head marking is open, the notion of argument is quite broad in these languages, comprising quite a lot of things that in more familiar languages are expressed as adjuncts. There are also causative, which we haven't discussed and won't discuss in any detail, and other valency changing mechanisms such as applicatives, which also interact with syntax in obvious but also intricate ways. And there are such phenomena, some of which will be discussed today, like reflexive and reciprocal marking, nominalizations, converbs, and other non-finite forms, and relativization as one of the pervasive morphosyntactic mechanisms of these languages. So today I'm going to address the question about the ways polysynthetic morphology interacts with syntax, and also even more generally asking whether it is at all true that complex morphology correlates with simpler syntax. This is the question one could ask. I'm actually not sure that I'm going to answer it in any proper way because, well, measuring the complexity of morphology has proven to be an extremely complex task in itself. But measuring the complexity or simplicity of syntax, at least for a person who is not exactly a specialist on syntactic theory, is something quite insurmountable. However, we shall address some questions of whether presence of something in morphology implies absence of something in syntax. And I will talk both on Northwest Caucasian languages and on some other languages which have been discussed in the literature. So without further ado, I will start with an overview of some syntactic correlates of polysynthesis that have been proposed in the literature. And of course, I'll start with the famous book by Mark Baker, the Polysynthesis Parameter, which is one of the deepest and most thought-provoking contributions to the literature on this topic. One can have whatever views on his approach, which is generative. However, this book makes a very important empirical and theoretical contribution, and one cannot neglect it. So for Baker, polysynthesis is a macro parameter of the syntax-morphology interface, and he defines it with relation to what he calls morphological visibility condition, which reads as follows: a phrase X is visible for theta role assignment, that is, well, in more down-to-earth terms, it means it can be an argument of a predicate. So a phrase X is visible for theta role assignment from a head Y only if X is co-indexed in the word containing Y, either via an agreement relationship or via a movement relationship, that is incorporation. So in other terms, for Baker, polysynthesis is a combination of head marking and productive noun incorporation, and productive is important. So the noun incorporation, I argued, still exists in some form in Northwest Caucasian, doesn't count for Baker. It's definitely not productive, and so it's not modeled through movement. So by this definition, many traditional polysynthetic languages, such as Eskimoan and Northwest Caucasian, are excluded. And probably this, as well as some other reasons, have led to Baker's theory not really gaining much ground, either in generative or in functional typological circles. So Baker's theory is not the accepted theory of polysynthesis among the generative linguists. Still, as I said, it's an extremely important contribution to not only to generative linguistics, but also to general linguistics, and some of its corollaries are definitely worth exploring. So let's look at some of them. So Baker's theory of polysynthesis is a kind of reformulation of an older hypothesis called pronominal arguments hypothesis, which was, well, introduced into contemporary linguistic theory, I think by Alois Jelinek, however, in 1984. However, I think that similar ideas have been expressed by many linguists before, probably even by Sapir. So the idea is that argument positions in polysynthetic languages, or even in head-marking languages in general, are occupied by pronominal affixes or incorporated nominal roots. And given that, at least in the generative theory, argument positions are unique. So there is, if there is a structural position for an argument, then there is only one structural position. An argument can't be simultaneously in several structural positions, at least within one clause. So since argument positions are unique, external nominals in polysynthetic languages can't be arguments. Hence, they are adjuncts. And this pronominal arguments hypothesis implies non-configurationality. That is, free order of noun phrases or discourse-based order of noun phrases. And in general, optionality of noun phrases, since adjuncts normally are optional. And also, as a more specific corollary, lack of a rigid order within noun phrases, and also possibility for the noun phrases to be discontinuous. So let's have a look at some examples. This is an example from Cayuga, an Iroquois language, from a paper by Marianne Methuen, who actually makes largely a similar point, albeit in a totally different framework. So these three constituents, the verb, the subject, and two noun phrases, can occur in any possible order, and any of these three orders can have any of these two interpretations. So either the buffalo or the Six Nations can be interpreted as either the subject or the object in any of these orders. So this is what people usually call free order of major sentence constituents. The following example shows that in Biningunbok, a Gungungan language of Australia, discontinuous nominals are possible. So a big barramundi is a type of a fish. It's no problem that barramundi is to the left of the verb, and big, which is apparently a modifier of the barramundi, is to the right of the verb. Well, if neither of them is an argument, but they are two adjuncts, they can be related to each other in some special way. They don't need to form a single phrase. However, Northwest Caucasian languages are clearly different from this picture, because although clausal word order in these languages is sort of free that is dependent, or at least highly sensitive to information structure considerations, there is a clear preference for SOV, especially in dependent clauses. especially in those cases where it is not always, well, where confusion can arise. And anyway, there aren't probably many languages where word order is really as free as Mithun argues for Cayuga. And if we look at noun phrases, then the order within noun phrases in the Northwest Caucasian languages is absolutely rigid, and discontinuity is prohibited. So at least for some of the parameters of non-configurationality, these languages don't hit the mark. And later I'll show that there are other aspects whereby Northwest Caucasian languages can probably be argued to be configurational rather than non-configuration. There is a number of other, even more interesting corollaries of Baker's morphological visibility condition, which he explores in detail in his book, such as absence of structure or grammatical case marking on nominals. Well, if the nominals are adjuncts, then they can't be case marked in the normal structural way. Absence of obligatory control constructions with infinitives, also because, well, infinitive is a verbal form, and if it has to have a relation to any argument, then this biomorphological visibility condition, this argument has to be indexed somehow on the infinitive, and if it's indexed, then it's no longer a real infinitive, but some kind of more or less finite verb. Another interesting corollary, which I won't be able to explain in detail, is that morphological causatives should be very restricted in such languages. They should be only formed from unaccusative verbs, that is, verbs that have just one internal argument, probably because our complex predicate formation in languages with adhering to the morphological visibility condition would crash if it were required to accommodate more than just one argument. And also absence of reflexive pronouns and non-referential quantifiers such as anybody, each, things like that.
Sorry, you just said absence of the non-referential quantifiers?
Yes.
In your presentation?
No, no, absence of these of reflexive pronouns and non-referential quantifiers in the languages that adhere to Baker's definition of polysynthesis.
Clear.
Northwest Caucasian are different, as I'll show you a bit later. So, some examples. So this is a clausal complement in Mohawk. Baker's main subject language and, well, a canonical polysynthetic language for Baker. So in order to express something like I'm trying to fix the car and with an controlled infinitive clause, infinitival clause in English, Mohawk uses a biclausal construction with an optative mood. So it's something like I'm trying so that I fix the car, and one can't help thinking of Balkan languages with their absence of true infinitives here. But I'm not going to give any examples from Bulgarian or modern Greek. Yeah.
How about the nominalizer?
What do you mean by the nominalizer? Well, as far as I understand, this nominalizer doesn't nominalize the verb. It relates to I think it's related to the car in some way. So at least as far as I understand Baker, this second word of this example is a finite verbal form. Just it's not in indicative mode. Next example shows that morphological causatives in Mohawk are indeed only possible from verbs like intransitive melt, from an accusatives. And as you can see, the patient, the direct object, is incorporated. But the main thing is that one can't form the same construction with this causative suffix from a transitive verb. But again, for the Northwest Caucasian languages, this doesn't work at all. They have extremely productive causativization, which applies to any kind of verbs, including transitives, ditransitives, and even some morphological causatives. And this example shows, again from Biningun, shows that at least in this language, well, in many languages, reflexive and reciprocal constructions are formed not by means of reflexive and reciprocal pronouns, but with the help of certain verbal affixes. And what is important for Baker's theory is that these affixes detransitivize the verb. So reciprocally or reflexively fighting is an intransitive verb in Biningun, not a transitive verb. So basically reflexivization and or reciprocalization is kind of a lexical operation in polysynthetic languages, according to Baker. If we compare Baker's prototype of polysynthesis with the Northwest Caucasian languages, we see that they don't really fit. So they're, in terms of word order, they partly fit, but in other terms, as I'll show, they don't fit at all. Because, well, they have controlled infinitives of some kind. As I said, their causativization is not restricted at all. With respect to reflexive and reciprocal pronouns, well, as I'll show, one could argue that the verbal markers that they exhibit are actually reflexive and reciprocal pronouns, not voice markers. And these languages do have non-referential quantifiers, even if those sometimes behave in unexpected ways. But I'm not going to speak about quantifiers in this talk. But of course, one has to remember that Northwest Caucasian languages are not polysynthetic languages according to Baker's definition in the to begin with, because they don't have productive noun incorporations. So probably it's not a problem for the theory that it don't exhibit many of the properties that follow from the morphological visibility condition. But still, if we take Baker's approach not as a theory that rigidly constrains polysynthesis, but as a set of parameters that can be, and predictions that can be empirically tested, then it's certainly worthwhile to look into Northwest Caucasian or other languages and see to what extent they follow Baker's predictions. So Baker's theory of polysynthesis is based on his own earlier approach to incorporation and affixation as a syntactic phenomenon, that is head movement. And interestingly, regardless of any particular framework, some polysynthetic languages actually give evidence of apparently syntax-like processes of morphological composition. And let me show you the behavior of noun incorporation in Southern Tiva, a Kiowa Tanoan language of USA that has been subject to a number of interesting theoretical discussions in 1980s and 1990s. So in Southern Tiva, there is noun incorporation. And as you may see in 6a, unmodified inanimate nouns are incorporated obligatorily. So this shirt can't hang around as a noun phrase at all. It has to be incorporated. The following example shows something still more interesting. So there is an incorporated shirt in 7a and an incorporated shirt in 7b. And Southern Tiva has something like gender. Its agreement system is actually quite complex, and I'm not going to go into any detail. So what is important is a shirt belongs to agreement class A, and hat belongs to the agreement class B. And contrary to some expectations, probably, incorporated nouns trigger agreement on the verb with respect to their agreement clause. So incorporation of inanimate nouns is obligatory, and it is sensitive, and it's visible for verbal agreement. Moreover, incorporated nouns can take external modifiers. This is not unprecedented. This also occurs in some other languages, but still, it can be considered evidence for Southern Tiva noun incorporation to take place in syntax. And still more interestingly, noun incorporation in Southern Tiva can interact with relativization. So in 9a, this dipper is incorporated into the verb with which with which it forms a relative clause. And it's possible to refer to this incorporated noun in the main clause. And noun B shows a different configuration whereby the relative clause, this second word, what I found, refers to the incorporated noun. So at least for this particular language, one really can argue that noun incorporation is a syntactic process. But of course, it doesn't mean that noun incorporation is a syntactic process in any other language. And of course, substantiva noun incorporation is exceptional at least in some respects. So to conclude this overview, most claims about non-trivial properties of the syntax of polysynthetic languages have been based on the data of just one or few selected languages. Baker also, so despite Baker's book discussing the data of quite a lot of languages, his major language is Mohawk, and this is basically the only language he has done fieldwork on. So he bases his in-depth analysis on Mohawk and then looks for other languages for secondary sources where he hoped to find similar phenomena which might turn out not to be really so very similar to those in Mohawk. The interpretation of all such facts often depends on one's preferred theoretical framework and whether any significant generalizations in this realm are possible, I think remains an open question for an empirical study. So in the following, I shall discuss certain concrete phenomena. And the first of these is going to be case marking. I'd like to begin with Andrei Kibrik's paper, where he argues that semantic roles in head-marking languages may be expressed by linear positions in the verb morphological structure. And he further argues that these positions are functional analogues of case affixes in dependent marking languages, and therefore can be understood and glossed in terms of cases such as nominative, ergative, accusative, and the like. And I exemplify this from one example from Mayence, where you see that in a 3-argument clause, none of the 3 non-phrases bears any case marking, but instead everything is indeed expressed in the verb, where there are pronominal affixes that one can in principle gloss as, if you wish, accusative, ergative, dative, and the like. And moreover, in languages with open head marking like Northwest Caucasian, applicatives that introduce oblique arguments can be seen as functional analogues of adpositions. And this is very clearly seen, for instance, in Navajo, where there is an incorporated postposition with a pronominal immediately preceding it. And there are cases where a diachronic link between adpositions and applicatives is particularly apparent, like for instance in Abkhaz, where just the same element can occur both as a postposition indexing its argument, as in 13a. So the hammer, with it, I hit him. And the same element can be incorporated into the verb as an applicative. Like the hammer, I hit him with it. And there are other examples of this kind in Abkhaz, and also some examples of this kind in Abaza. So many polysynthetic and head marking languages in general do not have any grammatical case marking on core nominals. Still, some of them have peripheral case marking of various types. And in some languages, like Yimas, there is just one all-purpose oblique case. So the Yimas oblique covers such roles as location in 14, time in 15, instrument in 16, or complement of a postposition in 17, and some others. But of course, there are also other languages with richer systems, such as, for instance, Nungubuyu, another Gumvinguan language, which has quite an elaborate system of semantically specialized peripheral cases comprising, for instance, allative dative, ablative, progressive, proposive, locative, instrumental, etc. I'm not even sure. I think it's not the whole list. I just put those Nungubuyu cases that fit onto the slide. And there are also quite a lot of polysynthetic and head marking languages of this type. But this isn't, of course, a whole story, because many head marking and polysynthetic languages, in fact, do show case marking of core nominals. And in some of these languages, the subsystems of head marking and dependent marking are clearly independent of each other and follow divergent principles, which is certainly problematic for Kubrick's proposal, because if you have both head marking, which works like case, and dependent marking, well, which is case by definition, then the question is, can you have two case systems in the language which work independently of one another and at the same time simultaneously with one another? So Murin Patha, another Australian language, nicely illustrates it in a quite a straightforward way. So in Murin Patha, in these examples, you see both independent pronouns and pronominal affixes in the verb, and the independent pronouns show ergative, absolutive alignment, whereas the bound pronominals on the verb show nominative, accusative alignment. So the same bound pronominal on the verb can agree, if you wish, with two different case forms of nominals, either with the absolutive or with the ergative. And the same case form of nominals, the absolutive can trigger either subject or object agreement on the verb. Another Australian language in Gandhi shows a still more complex phenomenon where basically there is also a more or less straightforward system of nominative accusative alignment of phenomenal markers on the verb, at least in these examples, but they correspond to three different object case markers. So depending on the verb and on that type of nominal and on probably on the particular meaning that the speaker wishes to express, the speaker can choose between the absolutive, the allative, and the dative for the object. But verbal agreement is not sensitive to this at all. So these two mechanisms simply don't work in concert. They are independent of each other to a considerable extent. And this happens quite frequently in languages. But if we turn to the Northwest Caucasian languages, the situation there is different. So these languages are highly consistent in their head marking, distinguishing the absolutive, the ergative, and the indirect object or oblique series of pronominal prefixes. So actually there are, more formally, there are two series, the absolutive and the oblique. The oblique consisting, and the oblique can function both as ergative and indirect object, and importantly, there are at least three slots in the verbal form which correspond to the absolutive, the ergative, and the indirect object, and I'll show that in a minute. So head marking is very consistent across the family, but with respect to dependent marking, there is a major split between Abkhaz and Abaza, which don't have any dependent marking on core nominals, and Ubykh and Circassian, which do have. So examples 20 and 21 show the patterns of head marking, and you see that the verbal forms are largely isomorphic. They all have the absolutive and the position in the very beginning, then goes the indirect object, and then there is an ergative before the root, closest to the root. And this is the pattern shared by all languages of the family, and obviously going back to the proto-language. But now come the differences. So as I said, Abkhaz and Abaza don't have any core case marking nominals. And so example 22 is shows more or less the same thing as an example from Yimas that I've shown you before. But if we translate this example into West Circassian, we see that West Circassian has absolutive and oblique case marking on nominals. So the book, the direct object is in the absolutive, and the other noun phrases, both the agent and recipient, are in the oblique. And this is the basic pattern for Circassian languages, and well, also for Ubykh. The only difference being that Ubykh doesn't have any overt marking of the absolutive. So one might ask, what are the absolutive versus oblique cases in Circassian? Simply and straightforwardly match the absolutive versus oblique division of bond pronominals. And the point is that, in fact, they don't. So first of all, there are no overt third-person prefixes of the absolutive series in Circassian. The second thing is that it is only third-person nominals that can take the absolutive case suffix re in Circassian. So there is a complementary distribution. If you have overt head marking, you have no absolutive case or the pronoun. And if you had overt case marking, which is only possible on a noun phrase, then you don't have a corresponding absolutive prefix. But the interesting thing is that it is possible to append a nominal to a pronoun. Something like "we boys came," but surprisingly, the case of this nominal is not the absolutive, it is the oblique, and it is quite robust. So this actually shows that nominals that are cross-referenced by overt absolutive prefixes are in fact in the oblique case. Another evidence for the special status of the absolutive case in Circassian is quite complex, and it is word order in internally headed relative clauses. It was discovered and described by Yuri Landa, my friend and colleague. So there is a constraint on word order in internally headed relative clauses, which reads as follows: that internal head of the relative clause, which is marked by the adverbial case, cannot linearly occur between the predicate of the relative clause and the absolutive marked nominal. And there is no such restriction on the position of any oblique marked nominals, regardless of their grammatical function. So let's have a look. This is an internally headed relative clause by Circassian: the thief who dropped the gold. So that is the internal head, the thief. In the adverbial case, that is a predicate of the relative clause which occurs to the right. It bears the case marker appropriate for the whole nominal constituent. So this whole example is a noun phrase. In this case, in the absolutive case, like the thief who dropped the gold ran away. And that is relative marker that relativizes the head. And there is the absolutive argument, the gold. So literally, it is the thief from whose hand the gold dispersed. And importantly, these three constituents can only occur in this particular order. In particular, it's not possible to move the absolutive to the left of the semantic head because of this constraint on word order. But if we change the construction and relativize the absolutive itself, like then use that the chief will tell the chief is the agent. It is in the oblique case, and here, although preferably the semantic head occurs in the beginning of the relative clause. Still, it's possible to move the agent to the left of it because the agent is in the oblique case. So this is very robust evidence for the structural nature of case marking in Circassian, of nominal case marking in Circassian, and also for evidence for nominals in Circassian, at least for the nominals in the absolutive case being arguments, not adjuncts. And that is work by Ksenia Yershova within the generative framework, who argues in great detail and based on extensive and meticulous empirical research that while that the syntax of Circassian is in many ways configurational and obeys most of the constraints are proposed on the basis of other languages. And again, this work is real hardcore minimalist generative grammar, but it's not only very interesting, but also quite readable. And I recommend it, not only because Ksenia is my friend and former student, but because it's really very interesting. So at least in Circassian languages, at least some nominals are arguments and bear structural case marking. So let's move on to reflexives and reciprocals. And here I'm also going to quote Ksenia Yershova. So Baker's ideas on the absence of reflexives and reciprocals in polysynthetic languages are somewhat simplifying as follows. Since nominals in these languages are adjuncts due to their morphological visibility condition, they are not subject to the binding theory. Therefore, polysynthetic languages can't have any reflexive and reciprocal pronouns, since these have to be subject to binding theory. And instead, these languages employ other means, such as, well, certain body part expressions used with possessor affixes used to as intensifiers and also as reflexives, and importantly, verbal markers that render the verbs intransitives. So they basically use something like reflexive or reciprocal voice. But now let's look at Circassian, okay? Because these languages don't fit well into this picture. So let's start with the transitive, with reflexives and the transitive verb. Oh, there's a mistake. It's not indirect object, but absolutive. So the most canonical reflexive configuration obtaining between the agent and the patient of a transitive verb is expressed in Circassian by replacing a personal affix in the absolutive position by a reflexive affix. But importantly, nothing happens to the ergative affix. The ergative affix is in place, so the verb remains transitive. The same occurs in another configuration available for transitive verbs, that is when the reflexive relation obtains between the agent and, for instance, a beneficiary introduced by an applicative. Again, you simply replace the indirect object personal prefix with an indirect object reflexive prefix in the appropriate position. And finally, since these languages have plenty of bivalent and transitive verbs, such as, for instance, forget, the more agentive participant is the absolutive, and the more patientive participant is an indirect object introduced by an applicative. So to reflexivize this verb, you replace the indirect object prefix by a reflexive prefix. So basically, this is a subject or agent-oriented reflexive construction with affixes working very similarly to reflexive pronouns of more familiar languages. And well, I think I'll skip the details of reciprocals. Reciprocals work basically in the same way with some work in the transitive paradigm, but still the conclusion is that reflexive and reciprocal affixes in Circassian occupy the same slots in the verb as the corresponding personal affixes, and they do not decrease the verb's valency. And these affixes, as have been argued again by Ksenia Yershova, are subject to the same bounding conditions as corresponding free pronouns in other languages. And hence, they are, well, regardless of a theory, they are morphologically bound reflexive and reciprocal pronouns and a voice attribute. They are not markers of voice of any kind. They are pronouns. While if in these languages personal affixes work as pronouns in many respects, they are anaphoric. So it's probably not so surprising that reflexive and reciprocal affixes also work like pronouns. And well, I can't go into it at all, but I can certainly add that since these languages have free pronouns as well, it's not surprising that they actually have some elements that can be considered free, reflexive, and reciprocal pronouns as well. And here I refer you to work by Alexander Letucci, which is also quoted here. So the next topic I'd like to discuss is complementation and non-finiteness in polysynthetic languages. So again, going back to Baker's book, he claims that true polysynthetic languages cannot have true non-finite clauses with raw subjects, that is, subjects that can't be overtly expressed in any way. since these constructions are simply precluded by the morphological visibility condition. That requires all arguments to be formally expressed on the verb. So again, if you are a candidate for infinitive status, then you are a verb, you have to establish your relation with your subject, and the only way to establish this relation under the morphological visibility condition is to overtly agree with your subject. Well, not necessarily overtly, but to agree with your subject. And if you agree with your subject, then you can't be an infinitive. That's Baker's logic. And in a very different framework, there is also a paper by Marianne Methuen called How to Avoid Subordination. And she observes that, absolutely independently of Baker, she observes that there are many polysynthetic languages that don't actually show subordinated and complement clauses of the type familiar from the European languages. And she also looks into strategies that these languages employ to express polypredicative constructions. So what do polysynthetic languages have instead of, for instance, infinitives, in order to encode interclausal relations? So the simplest thing is just to juxtapose apparently independent clauses, but there are also constructions that are more or less similar to subordination. So of course it's possible to use finite subordination with non-declarative modes. Like in the Mohawk example that I showed you quite some time ago, with an optative mode. And at least since Baker's book had been published, there have been quite extensive discussions of how this type of subordination, most notably found in Balkan languages, fits within the generative theory of control. There is also a possibility to use special type of nominalization, well, various types of nominalization, in particular nominalization of full clauses, but also one can form complex predicates by means of verb root serialization or a fixation. This phenomenon has been recently called morphologically bound complementation and studied in a couple of works. So Nolobuyo arguably shows close juxtaposition of independent clauses. So, well, these clauses are not independent in discourse, but arguably they are, the second one is not subordinate to the first one in any syntactic way. So in order to say I want to go, they say something, I want it, I'll go. Classical Nahuatl shows a peculiar type of nominalization by means of articles. So if you want to nominalize anything, actually, if you want to use anything as a nominal, you have to put article for it. And if this something happens to be a clause, it's no problem. So it's something like he told you that you will make it. And this article is exactly the article which occurs in regular nominals, also before proper names. Again, this is nothing similar to infinitives. And of course, as you see in example 34, the verb is finite and it bears all pronominal markers for both of its arguments. Morphologically bound complementation by means of verb root serialization is found in, probably not in many languages, but in some languages. It would be extremely interesting to conduct a typological study of this phenomenon. So substantiva can form compounds like forget to buy. But I have to mention it as a side note. It's not obligatory. Apparently, substantiva also has the same strategy as Nahuatl. That is, it can nominalize its finite verbs instead of incorporating one into another. But I don't give an example here. And there are also languages that have affixes expressing meanings similar to complement-taking predicates in other languages, such as pretend, for example, in Chippewa, an Algonquian language. So there is a simulative suffix that can attach to verbs. And so the result means something like we pretended to cry, but probably it isn't a biclausal construction in any syntactic sense of this term. Let's now look at some direct counterexamples to Baker's claims. And these come from certain polysynthetic languages of Australia, which seem to have non-finite verbal forms, but also from Northwest Caucasian. So let's look at Mbanga, a Gunwingan language which was claimed to have infinitives. So there are certain verbal forms that are analyzed as infinitives. They can't occur as predicates of independent clauses, so they should be considered non-finite. And in 38, you see that this infinitive actually bears a pronominal prefix for the subject. So it doesn't look like a counterexample to Baker's proposal. However, the next example doesn't bear a pronominal affix. So this looks like a true infinitive without, with a non-expressed subject argument, which is controlled from the matrix clause. And Nordinger and Solvik argue for this analysis and also against Baker's analysis of this particular data are based on earlier sources. So according to Nordinger and Solvik, Rimbaga has infinitives, both with and without pronominal indexes, and both types are clearly non-finite. And There is also another Winguan language, Dalabon, that, as argued by Evans, clearly marks non-finite verbal forms by various means, including special series of pronominal prefixes, as well as various subordinating affixes, including case suffixes. Let's now turn to Northwest Caucasian languages. So they possess a really rich and variegated system of non-finite forms, that is, verbal forms that are unable to have an independent clause. These forms include Mazdars, or nominalizations, which can have different combinations of verbal and nominal properties. There are also different converbs and relative verbal forms. So, most importantly, the majority of non-finite verbal forms in Northwest Caucasian show exactly the same patterns of pronominal marking as finite forms occurring in independent clauses. So, in this way, they simply don't differ from finite forms. And this can be illustrated by a buzzer, where you can see a purposive converb in 40b, indexing the three participants of the verb say in absolutely the same morphological way as a finite form does. But this is a purposive converb. It can't be used as a head of an independent clause. It's not some kind of non-indicative mood, if you wish. There are subjunctive forms in a buzzer, they also index all the relevant participants, but they occur in independent clauses. But now let's look at a special case, that is at Mazdars, which are more similar to nouns. And the Abkhaz Mazdar was analyzed by Leonid Kulikov in a 1999 paper. And he shows that the Abkhaz Mazdar first never takes the absolutive prefixes as a verb would do. Well, it's a nominal, so it shouldn't take absolutive prefixes unless it occurs as a nonverbal predicate. But more importantly, it never, ever agrees with the subject argument. That is the argument which is controlled from the matrix clause. Let's see how it works. So for transitive verbs, the Mazdar shows agreement with the patient, the direct object, by means of possessor prefixes. So the former starts literally tying off his cow. With bivalent intransitive verbs, the Mazdar agrees with the indirect object. So the son starts help of his relatives, if you wish. But the most interesting case is constituted by the monovalent verbs, because Mazdars of monovalent verbs don't show any person marking whatsoever. This R before the Mazdar is the article. Actually, at least in how I see it, if Mazdar were simply a nominal, we would actually expect it to agree with the subject. We would expect something like the boy starts his crying, but we don't see it. We see the boy starts the crying, if you wish. So probably in the end, Abhas Mazda embedded under certain complement-taking predicates is in fact a controlled infinitive with a pro-subject which can't be expressed in any overt way. Hence, again, a clear counterexample to Baker's theory. Yeah, I think I'd like to show you this piece of data, even though I'm running out of time. So regardless of the issues connected to finiteness and non-finiteness, some polysynthetic languages show quite an expected patterning of nominals in main and subordinate clauses. These have been mostly studied within generative grammar, and they have been subsumed under the heading of so-called condition C violations. Condition C requires, of the binding theory, requires that the nominal is free in its binding domain. That is, it can't be referentially dependent on anything, especially on a pronoun. In English, we say John sees himself, not he sees John, meaning he says John is impossible, doesn't have an interpretation whereby he and John refer to the same person. And this is an effect of this condition C of the generative binding theory. So condition C violations are in polysynthetic languages occur where an argument which is shared between two clauses is overtly expressed only in the subordinate clause. And this phenomena has been documented for quite a number of diverse languages, including Northwest Caucasian. So in Circassian, in West Circassian, what we see in these examples is, while the matrix verb, the begin verb, is a transitive verb, and the beginner is cross-referenced by the ergative marker in the verb, and if it's expressed overtly, then it should be expressed by the oblique case mark nominal. And if the dependent verb is intransitive, as dance in this case, then of course we don't expect to see any absolutive marked nominal in this construction, because under ordinary controlled relations, the controller occurs in the upstairs clause and the zero occurs in the downstairs clause. However, not only 44A is possible, but 44B is also possible, where the nominal, the girl who started to dance, is marked absolutive, and this absolutive can only come from the dependent verb, because it's only the dependent verb that is intransitive. So the syntactic structure of these examples is roughly like that. In 44A, the girl is in the matrix clause and the absolutive zero is in the dependent clause. But in 44B, it's just the opposite. The absolutive nominal is in the dependent clause and the zero is in the matrix clause. 44B is an example of so-called backwards control, which has been studied for a number of languages, also for certain North-Dagestanian languages, East Caucasian languages, which are not polysynthetic. But still, it's interesting that such phenomena are attested in a number of different polysynthetic languages.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you give us a little translation of what for Davis? I don't quite see how that
Yeah.
three singular plugs into the configuration.
Well, so the literal translation of 44a is the girl started to dance.
The dating three singular refers to
The
dance? Or
no, it refers to the girl.
girl?
So
And the everything also.
it refers to the girl because this starting doing something is a transitive verb in Circassian, and the person who starts doing something is expressed as the agent of this verb. So in the verb, it is always referred to by the ergative prefix, but outside of the verb, it can be expressed in two different ways. And so that 44b example can be translated something like, well, it can't be literally translated into English because English doesn't tolerate anything of this kind. And it would be wrong to translate it as something like it started for the girl to dance, because we see that the matrix verb still expresses the agent in the same way. So the girl is the agent of the matrix verb. Only the syntax of these languages allows to overtly express the nominal in the downstairs clause as well as then in the upstairs clause. And what is important is that this pattern obtains only with zeros. Only when the relevant argument is expressed only once. If you replace any of these zeros by an overt third-person pronoun, everything is disrupted. Both sentences become ungrammatical because neither of these pronouns would be able to refer to the girl.
Would you give the same pattern with any verb? So if you replace a dance by some other verb, would it still be the same structures?
Yes.
The question is motivated by the fact that dancing is attached to patterns in a peculiar way
It's not relevant. Dance is chosen here only because it's intransitive and because it fits well semantically. This patterning has been shown quite extensively for many kinds of matrix verbs as well as all possible kinds of dependent verbs.
And the dative then refers to girl.
No, the dative is dummy.
Okay.
It's simply part of the lexical verb.
Thank you.
So, probably even more surprisingly, the same pattern occurs when the nominal is quantified. So everyone started to dance. This everyone, the quantifier, can occur both in the matrix clause and in the dependent clause, and at least for the mainstream theories of syntax semantics mapping, this is a scandal, because quantifiers should not be able to bind variables from below. But still, this is an empirical fact of these languages. So the question is, so the conclusion could be that such condition C violation might suggest that full NPs in these languages have certain spatial status. However, at least for me, it is completely unclear how such effects could be explained within Baker's theory of polysynthesis. And moreover, I think that if these effects had been just consequences of the pronominal arguments hypothesis that is related to the adjunct status of nominals, we would expect them to occur in everywhere. In simple clauses, for instance, or not to be constrained by certain syntactic configurations, but this isn't something we observe. Nothing of this kind occurs in simple clauses. Simple clauses in Northwest Caucasian are extremely well behaved. No condition C violations, no effects that would point out something strange in terms of anaphora or quantification. So this phenomenon is a phenomenon of polyclausal constructions. And so finally, although I'm running out of my time, I'd like to talk about polyfunctional relativization in Northwest Caucasian as well. So relativization in Northwest Caucasian is marked on the verb. I'll give examples from Abaza, but other languages work pretty much the same way. So the basic sentence is, I gave the girl an apple. And if we relativize the apple, basically, what we basically do is we replace the absolutive prefix by a relative prefix in the same position. And well, in this case, the relative clause is pronominal, the head follows. It can also be internally headed, but it's not relevant here. If we want to relativize the girl, what we do is, again, we replace the appropriate indirect object personal prefix by an indirect object relative prefix in the same position. And if we want to relativize the ergative agent, yielding something, the boy who gave an apple to the girl, then again what we do is we replace the ergative personal prefix by an ergative relative prefix, or rather by a relative prefix in the ergative position. This may look very complex, but in fact it's absolutely logical and straightforward. So relative affixes in Northwest Caucasian languages occupy the same slots in the verbal template as their corresponding personal affixes. And in a recent paper by Yuri Landa and Michael Daniel, they were argued to be morphologically bound resumptive pronouns. And it makes good sense. And Since relativization in Northwest Caucasian is so special, it has been subject to quite extensive research by many people and within different frameworks, both generative and non-generative. So what do these languages do if they need to relativize adjuncts? So Abaza and Abkhaz have special relative affixes that relativize adjuncts. A special affix to relativize locations, like the school where we work, or a special prefix to relativize times, like the time when her mother came back. West Caucasian is even more special because it uses applicatives for relativization of adjuncts. So please have a look first at 52a. I return to the village. The village here is a true adjunct. It isn't cross-referenced in the verb, and it's not introduced by any applicative. It actually cannot be introduced by an applicative. The use of the applicative here is ungrammatical. But the only way to relativize anything in West Circassian, which isn't an absolutive, is by means of an indirect object relative prefix. And if you want to have an indirect object relative prefix in your verb, you have to applicativize the verb first. So in order to relativize the village, to yield something that the village shall return to, you have no other choice but to add an applicative specifically for the purposes of relativization and then relativize its argument. And this is a very robust pattern which is attested in many constructions in Circassian languages. Another important feature is that relative clauses are actually pervasive in these languages, also in spontaneous discourse, including headless relative clauses, which are used in a range of different functions. So they can occur as differential NPs denoting verbal arguments. Like in 53, those who saw him were surprised. So surprised to be surprised is actually a transitive verb. In Circassian, it has an ergative agent, and this agent is expressed as a relative verbal form marked with an oblique case, which is appropriate for this construction. It can also be used in pseudoclefts marking focus. This is a very productive way of managing information structure in these languages. So the speaker of this narrative wanted to focus language. So he said, what worries you is the language, using a relative, again, a relative verbal form. But relativizing the agent. And not surprisingly, the same strategy is employed also in constituent questions. So 55 reads literally as, what is it that worries you? Besides that, headless relatives also occur in adverbial subordination So for instance, the temporal relative affix in a buzzer can form something like temporal converbs, if you wish. When I finished school, I went to college. And also in complementation. In 57, you see another case of this spurious applicativization by means of an instrumental applicative, whether it's indirect or relativized, and this serves as not only as a relativization of instrument, but also as a relativization of manner, and as a general subordinator for facts. So it's something like she realized the fact that he didn't have courage. It occurs with the verbs like know, and it's quite frequent. And finally, relative verbal forms also serve as a basis for matrix constituent interrogative verbal forms in Abkhaz and Abaza. And I have written about it also with Ivana Kapolingo, with whom we analyze this phenomenon in terms within the framework of formal semantics. So again, Abaza headless relative clauses can refer to individuals, like in 58, I eat what Zarina buys. But it can also convey an embedded question. I asked what Zarina buys. It's already not an individual, it's something what in formal semantics is called individual concept. But most surprisingly, Abaza has a number of suffixes, well, affixes, that can be added to these relative verbal forms and result in verbal forms that convey matrix questions. So what does Zarina buy? There is no interrogative pronoun of any kind. There is just a relative verbal form to which a special non-human interrogative suffix is added. And who buys milk shows the same pattern. So the question is about the agent. So it is the agent that is relativized. And since the question is about a human, there is a human interrogative suffix that is added to this relative verbal form. And of course, these interrogative verbal forms are fully finite, despite their relativization morphology, because they can only occur in independent clauses. They can't occur as embedded questions. And there is also a special adverbial interrogative prefix forming interrogative verbal forms referring to places, manners, and times, also based on their corresponding relative verbal forms. So this strategy of forming constituent questions is typologically highly unusual and probably unique. But again, it is absolutely logical and fits quite well within the morphosyntax as well as morphology-syntax interface of these languages. So let me summarize. Languages with polysynthetic morphologies show many peculiarities in their syntax. However, evidence for something like polysynthetic syntax is, in my view, scarce and not always straightforward. But still, polysynthetic languages are, of course, remarkable in deploying many aspects of their morphology for syntactic purposes. And in particular, Northwest Caucasian languages employ applicatives to introduce peripheral participants into the clause. And this mechanism also feeds relativization. They express reflexivity, reciprocity, and relativization by means of special verbal markings that belong to the pronominal paradigm, and use their typologically outstanding morphological relativization strategy in a wide range of functions, including complementation, focus, and questions. And this is all. Thank you very much for your attention. So before I forget, I think there is a question in the chat. Yeah, so Daniel Krause asks, how about the girl started to write a book? How is book marked then? So this obviously refers to, yeah.
Slide 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
It refers to the dance example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
123.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where is it? It's
23, 2.
yes, yeah. So the girl started to write a book would be very straightforward because to write is a transitive verb. So the girl will be in the oblique case, and the book will be in the absolutive case, and the downstairs verb to write will show cross-reference with a girl in the same by means of the same third singular ergative affix which we see and begin. And since both verbs are transitive, we wouldn't so easily observe these two different syntactic structures. So it would be quite straightforward, I think. I hope I answered your questions, Daniel.
Kind of. So the two weird examples you gave here, like the A and B's, the opposition between the oblique and absolutive, well, let's call them actors or whatever. This only applies to intransitive verbs, like dance, when you have the masdar as for an intransitive verb, and not for transitive verbs.
Not exactly. I think, well, it applies to all kinds of verbs. However, it can be clearly seen only in those cases where the relevant argument, that is the argument shared between the matrix verb and the dependent verb, would have different case marking, depending on whether it belongs to the matrix verb or to the dependent verb. So I chose, well, actually not I, but the authors, I quote, chose the intransitive verb dance precisely because it governs the absolutive, in contrast to the matrix verb, which governs the oblique. If I took a different matrix verb, for instance, want, which is intransitive, I would do the opposite. I would choose an example like the girl wants to write a book, because in this case, the the girl receives the absolutive case from the matrix verb and the oblique case from the dependent verb. So it's only for the it's only the matter of exposition. I hope it's clearer now.
I see. Thank you.
And of course, it's also possible to play with word order with adverbials, for instance, like, I don't know, the girl started to dance an hour ago. And no, probably not an hour ago. Well, anyway, it's also possible to show the same effects with the help of appropriate adverbials, provided it is possible to show that the adverbial belongs either only to the matrix clause or only to the dependent clause. So are there any further comments or examples, please?
What you said about the relative items at the end, maybe think of Irish, which has systematically relative verb forms that come from historically from the incorporation of some relative element, but synchronically you can't predict them, so people have to learn them. And what they certainly do are these flat sentences, so that if I'm not mistaken, not only in Irish but also in other languages, and probably the uses of the relative forms go even further. Perhaps just for your amusement, it might be a nice to take. And there we have some academic data for Old Irish, Middle Irish, Modern Irish, and also the other Celtic languages might be fun.
Yeah. Well, the use of relativization for, well, the expression of occurs by means of pseudoclefts with relativization is, well, probably not a language universal, but a very widespread construction occurring everywhere or almost everywhere.
Yeah, in German it's like
yeah, well, of course there are languages that don't have it. Russian doesn't have it either, at least in the literal sense, but English has it, French has it, and languages of the Caucasus have it quite extensively because, again, the Dagestanian languages use relativization for focus very productively and very extensively. Although there are, so it's not related to polysynthesis, of course, but it's interesting how Northwest Caucasian, but it's polysynthetic morphology, how it how this strategy, which is widespread cross-linguistically, how it is integrated into the morphological system and how it employs the affordances of this morphology.
Yeah, the point about Irish was that there are specific relative
Yeah.
forms that don't
Exactly.
for instance, in English or something.
Yeah.
And they are widely used for uses that I forgot. But it could be interesting.
Yeah. Actually, in this way, these languages are also in some ways similar to the Western Austronesian languages with their so-called symmetrical voice systems, which also interact with relativization and normalization in intricate ways and employ these constructions for focus and all sorts of things.
I had a question on slide 67, if you like, the links that,
This one.
and that's what we're talking about, mixing dependent marking and head marking. Is there some diachronic reason why oblique marking on semantic agent is develops rather than this is quite unusual to me. In example 23. And that's really interesting. Why oblique on the
Well,
agent? And then ergative marking, I think there was an example. Yeah, and ergative marking on the in the structure. Nice example of the mixed systems.
well, this term, well, I don't know, probably one should not be confused with the term oblique because it's just a covered label for everything except the absolutive. It is, well, traditionally it is called ergative, but I'm reluctant to use the term ergative for anything except the agent, because this case occurs on really on almost everything but the absolutive. So it occurs on the agent corresponding to the ergative series of verbal prefixes. It occurs on indirect objects introduced by applicatives corresponding to the indirect object prefixes. It occurs on possessors with nouns, which are also indexed on the nouns. It occurs with complements of adpositions, which are normally also indexed on the adpositions. And finally, it also occurs in certain adjuncts. So, well, unfortunately, historically, it is totally unclear how they emerged. Comparative reconstruction doesn't help because all Circassian varieties are identical in this respect. And oblique also patterns more or less in the same way, apart from lacking overt marker for the absolutive. So what I haven't talked about at all is that these case markers can be absent, yielding a non-specific interpretation of the noun. So this can probably be evidence that they go back to some kind of articles or demonstratives. But this is more or less a wild hypothesis because reconstruction doesn't help and don't seem to be real cognates synchronically. So this case system can't really be explained. It has to be taken at face value. And while the term oblique is I think it's the most appropriate term because it doesn't imply anything. One could probably borrow the term relative case from Eskimo linguistics, but this would be unfortunate because since Northwest Caucasian have their relativization all over the place, one has to avoid using the term relative for anything but relativization.
Yes, exactly. Also in biology and historical in some other Iranian.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Well, of course, you wouldn't get all that mark.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Including the process.
Yeah.
External, what these external nominals, you just have the absolute with everything else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Including morphology,
yes. Instrumental, no. Some positions, I'd say. But locative, it's.
Yeah. Yes, in this way, remarkably, Circassian is similar to certain Iranian languages. Although I don't think it is an aerial fact. I don't think so. It can't be.
No, it's not really called now. I think it's stop here. That was
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for your very interesting feedback. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your seminars.
Thank you. No.
See you soon.